The morning Harlan handed me the folder, the coffee was already made. I had poured it myself at 5:30 the way I had poured it every morning of our 42 years together. And the steam was still rising when he sat down across from me in his navy cashmere robe and slid the manila envelope across the granite island. I was 69 years old. The sun was just coming up over Lake Michigan, turning the high windows of our North Shore condominium a kind of soft amber. And outside somewhere a single gull was calling. The sound was ordinary. Gulls call every morning on the lake. But that morning the sound felt like a bell tolling for a life I did not know was ending. He did not look at me when he spoke. He looked at the folder. His eyes stayed fixed on that manila rectangle the way a man looks at a task he wants finished. "Eleanor," he said, "I have signed them. I have been more than fair. Blythe and I would like to proceed without further delay." His voice had the slightly rehearsed quality of a man who would practice the sentence in the mirror. I noticed he used the word proceed the way a judge uses it, as though our marriage had become a matter of procedure. A file to be closed, a thing to be moved off a desk and into storage. I did not answer right away. I picked up my coffee. I felt my hand. And I want to tell you something true about that hand, because it matters to the whole rest of the story. My hand did not shake. I had expected it to. I had braced for it the way you brace for a wave when you wade out too far into the lake. But the wave did not come. My hand lifted the cup. My mouth drank the coffee. And somewhere inside my chest, a small, steady voice that I had not heard in a very long time said, "Eleanor Vanguard, you will not shake in front of this man. Not today. Not ever again." I set the cup down. I opened the folder. I read the top page slowly the way my grandmother had taught me to read any document that requires a signature, with a finger moving under every line. Dissolution of marriage. Equitable distribution. The condominium was his because the deed had always been in his name. A tax thing he had explained to me once in 1984, in a tone that did not invite questions. The cabin in Door County was his because his father had left it to him. The retirement accounts were his because the law in Illinois treats certain contributions in a certain way, and his attorney I could see had worked very hard on the certain way. I was to receive what they called a transitional allowance, a polite phrase for a sum of money that would keep me from becoming an embarrassment at the country club. For about 14 months. I closed the folder. I said, "Harlan." He looked up finally. His eyes were blue and a little watery, and for the first time I saw that he was afraid of me, or afraid of this moment, or afraid of something that lived behind this moment. And I thought, oh, you poor man. You have made yourself smaller to fit beside a woman half your age, and you did not even notice yourself shrinking. I said, "I will not contest it." Contest. He blinked. He had expected a scene. 42 years of marriage, and he thought he knew what I would do. And perhaps the saddest thing in the whole apartment that morning was the realization that he did not know me at all. I said, "I will sign them by Friday. I will be out of the apartment in 3 weeks. Please do not call me during that time. Please ask Blythe not to call me. If there is anything further, it can go through your attorney to mine." Then I took my coffee into the sunroom. I sat in the wingback chair my mother had given me for our wedding, and I watched the gull on the railing until it flew away. I did not cry. Not then. I do not want you to think I was made of stone, because I was not. The crying came later in pieces over months. But that morning I was hollowed out and very quiet. And in the quiet I heard for the first time in 4 decades the sound of my own thinking. And my own thinking said one clear word. It said, Millbrook. Let me tell you about the 42 years before that morning. Not because I want your sympathy. Because you need to understand what kind of foundation was crumbling, and how I did not see the cracks until the day I stood in the rubble. I met Harlan Vanguard in the spring of 1981 at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. I was 26 years old, a nurse. I had been working the cardiac unit for 3 years, and I was good at my work. I knew how to read monitors. I knew how to speak to frightened patients. I knew how to keep my voice steady when a code was called and the world compressed into 60 seconds of precision. Harlan was 30, a resident in cardiology. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead when he leaned over charts, and he had a way of walking that made you think he knew exactly where he was going, which it turned out he did. We dated for 6 months. He took me to restaurants where the waiters knew his name. He talked about his future with the kind of confidence I had never heard in another person. He said, Eleanor, I am going to build something, and I want you beside me. We were married in April of 1982, in a small ceremony at Fourth Presbyterian Church on Michigan Avenue. My mother was there. My father had died the year before. Harlan's parents came from Milwaukee. His father was a surgeon. His mother wore pearls and asked me twice if I was sure I wanted to marry into medicine. I said I was sure. I wore a simple white dress. We honeymooned in the Boundary Waters, canoeing through chains of lakes, under a sky so wide it felt like breathing. Harlan paddled from the stern. I navigated from the bow. And I remember thinking, this is partnership. This is what I want. We came back to Chicago. Harlan finished his residency. I kept working at Northwestern. We lived in a small apartment in Lincoln Park, with a kitchen the size of a closet and windows that looked out onto a courtyard where pigeons nested in the eaves. In 1984, Harlan joined a private cardiology practice. The money changed. He came home one night and said, Eleanor, I want you to quit nursing. I said, why? He said, because I can take care of us now. Because I want you to build a home. Because a doctor's wife should not be emptying bedpans. He did not say the last part cruelly. He said it as though he was offering me something. Freedom. Rest. A chance to stop working. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I loved nursing. I loved the clarity of it. The way you could see in real time whether you had helped someone. But Harlan was building something, and he wanted me beside him. And I thought, this is what partnership looks like at this stage. He provides. I support. So I quit. I did not know at 29 that I was trading my competence for his vision, that I was giving away the thing that made me certain of my own worth. I thought I was building a life. I was, just not mine. We bought the condominium in 1985. North Shore, high ceilings, granite countertops, lake views. Harlan's practice grew. He became known. Patients asked for him by name. He was invited to speak at conferences. I went with him sometimes. I stood beside him at receptions and smiled and made small talk with other doctors' wives. And I felt like a piece of furniture that had been arranged in the corner of someone else's room. In 1986, I gave birth to Rowan, a girl, 8 pounds 2 ounces, dark hair like her father. She came into the world screaming and I held her. And I thought, here's the thing I was supposed to build. Harlan was at a conference in Boston when she was born. He flew back 2 days later. He held her for 10 minutes, and then his pager went off and he handed her back to me and said, "Emergency consult. I will be home tonight." He was not home that night, or the next. Emergencies, he said. Patients who needed him. Rowan grew. She was a serious child, thoughtful. She asked questions I could not always answer. She liked to draw. She liked to sit in the sunroom with a sketch pad and make pictures of birds and trees and the lake beyond the window. Harlan was proud of her in the way men are proud of things they have acquired. He took her to his office Christmas party when she was 7 and introduced her to his colleagues as "my daughter the artist." She drew them a picture of a cardinal on a branch, and they applauded politely, and Harlan folded the picture and put it in his pocket. And I never saw it again. I tried. I want you to understand that. I tried to build something inside the shape of the life Harlan had designed. I volunteered at Rowan's school. I organized fundraisers for the hospital where I used to work. I kept the condominium the way Harlan liked it. Neat, elegant. A place where colleagues could be entertained. But somewhere in the long stretch of years between 1990 and 2020, I stopped being a person Harlan saw. I became a function. The woman who made sure the dry cleaning was picked up. The woman who remembered his colleagues' names at parties. The woman who smiled when he told the same stories I had heard 100 times. Rowan left for college in 2004. She went to Madison to study psychology. She called me every Sunday. She did not call Harlan. And then it was just the two of us in the condominium, Harlan and me. And the silence between us grew until it filled every room. I do not know when Blythe started. I found out in the spring of 2019, not because Harlan told me, because I saw the credit card statement. Dinners at restaurants we had never been to. Hotel rooms in cities where he said he was attending conferences alone. Jewelry purchases I never received. I did not confront him. I want you to understand why. Not because I was afraid, because I was calculating. I sat at the kitchen table with that credit card statement, and I thought, this has been coming for a long time, and when it arrives, I will not have anything left. So I started preparing, quietly. The way you prepare for a storm when you see the sky turning dark. I opened a separate bank account. I deposited $200 a month from the household budget. Small amounts Harlan would not notice. Over 5 years, it became $15,000. I researched Millbrook, Wisconsin. My grandmother Astrid's farm. The property she had left me when she died in 2013. 40 acres of cranberry bog that had been sitting vacant for 11 years because I had not known what to do with it. Because Harlan had said, "Eleanor, what would you do with a cranberry farm in the middle of nowhere?" I looked up property values. I found out the land was still registered in my name. I found out the taxes were current because my cousin had been paying them from Astrid's estate account. I found out the house was still standing, and I thought if he leaves, I will have somewhere to go. I did not tell anyone, not Rowan, not Cordelia. I kept the account statements in a folder in my nightstand, and I waited. The folder came on a Monday in April of 2024, and when Harlan slid it across the granite island, I was ready. 3 weeks. That is how long I had to pack a life. To decide what belonged to me and what belonged to the marriage and what belonged to the version of myself I was leaving behind. I started with clothes. I took the warm things, the practical things, sweaters and jeans and a wool coat I had bought in 1999 that Harlan had always said made me look like a farmer's wife. I left the cocktail dresses, the silk blouses, the heels I had worn to hospital fundraisers. Where I was going would not need silk. I took my mother's cast iron skillet. I took my grandmother Astrid's copper jam pan, the one she had used every autumn to make cranberry preserves. I took a cardboard box of photograph albums because photographs are the only thing in a divorce that belong equally to both people and to neither. And I kept the ones that told the truth about my life, which turned out to be the ones from before I met Harlan and the ones of Rowan. I took 3 houseplants, a jade and 2 African violets. I wrapped them in damp newspaper and settled them in a laundry basket on the passenger seat of the Volvo. I took my good reading glasses and my cheap reading glasses and a cardigan the color of oatmeal that Rowan had knitted for me the winter she was 19. I did not take the wedding china. I did not take the silver. I did not take the portrait of Harlan's father that had hung over our mantel since 1987. I left a note on the kitchen counter. It said, "Harlan, the key is on the hook. The alarm code is your mother's birthday as you requested. There is a pot roast in the freezer. Please eat it before it turns. E." I read it twice. I did not sign it with love. I did not sign it with anything but my initial, because love had been a word we had used for 42 years without I now realized ever quite agreeing on what it meant. On the last morning, I walked through the condominium one final time. The sun was coming up over the lake. The light was the same amber it had been the morning Harlan gave me the folder. I stood in the sunroom and I looked at the wingback chair, and I thought about all the hours I had sat there, waiting for what I was not sure anymore. I locked the door. I walked to the elevator. The doorman, a young man named Dimitri, whose wife had just had a baby girl, carried my last suitcase down to the car. When he set it in the trunk of the Volvo, he looked at me for a long moment. "Mrs. Vanguard," he said, "are you well?" I said, "Dimitri, I am going home." He nodded. He said, "Safe roads." He did not ask where home was. I was grateful. The drive from Chicago to Millbrook, Wisconsin is about 4 hours if the weather is kind. It was kind that April morning. The sky was thin and blue, and the sunlight had the cold clarity that makes the last snow on the fields look like spilled milk. I took Interstate 94 north through Milwaukee. I had driven this route 100 times in my childhood. My parents had taken me to visit grandmother Astrid every summer. We would leave early before the heat set in, and my father would drive while my mother navigated. And I sat in the back seat and watched the landscape change. The city would fall away. The suburbs would thin. And then there would be fields. Endless fields. Corn and soybeans and dairy farms with red barns and black and white cows standing in pastures that rolled to the horizon. I had loved those drives as a child. The sense of motion, the sense of leaving one world and entering another. Now I was making the drive alone. The Volvo wagon was a 2011 model, Hunter Green. It had 104,000 miles on it, and a scratch on the back bumper from the time I had backed into a grocery cart in Evanston in the rain. Harlan had always called it my car. Dismissively, the way men do when they want you to know that the real car, the Mercedes in the garage, is theirs. I was glad of the Volvo that morning. It was mine. It had carried me through a decade of small errands and forgotten trips. And now it was carrying me home. Somewhere around the Dells I began to cry. Not hard. Just a steady leaking. The way a cheap faucet leaks in the night. I did not pull over. I let the tears run. I let the road run. I let the radio play an old Peggy Lee song I had forgotten I knew. And by the time I saw the first sign for Millbrook, my face was dry and the sun was halfway down the sky. Millbrook is not a large town. The sign on the highway says population 400 and change. In October, when the Cranberry Festival comes, the whole county swells and the streets fill, and the marshes blaze red. But in April, it is a quiet place, a scatter of houses, a grocery, a feed store, a diner called the Cranberry Cup, and around it for miles in every direction lie the bogs, rectangle after rectangle, some flooded, some dry, some tended, some gone to willow and forgotten. I drove through the town slowly. I knew the way even though I had not driven it in 11 years. Grandmother Astrid's house sat 3 miles out of town, on a gravel road called Vanguard Lane. Not named for her exactly, but for her father-in-law who had come over from Gothenburg in 1902, with nothing but a sack of seed and a letter of introduction to a Danish man in Monroe County. The lane turned at an old silver maple. It dipped down through a stand of tamarack, and then it opened up, and there it was. I pulled the Volvo into the dirt drive and put it in park, and I sat for a long time with my hands on the wheel. The house was a century-old red-clapboard farmhouse, 2 stories, a steep roof, a brick chimney, a screen porch that sagged on the south side, the way old porches do when the frames rust and the posts settle. The porch steps were softer than I remembered. The scoop shed beyond the house leaned to the east like a drunk leaning into a wind, and past the shed down a short slope the old bog lay in its rectangles. 40 acres of dormant vines the color of dried blood, divided by raised earthen dikes. A little wooden sluice gate at the far end where the creek came through. The wild apple orchard on the north side of the house had gone half feral, but I could see already where the blossoms would come in May. I got out of the car. I stood in the gravel. The air smelled of cedar and melting snow and something faintly acidic that was the bog itself breathing. And I thought, oh, I am 69 years old and I did not know I was homesick. I did not know I had been homesick for 11 years, and possibly for 42. The key was under the 3rd flower pot, on the porch where my cousin Lars had told me it would be. The lock turned hard. The door swung open onto the smell of cedar and old wool, and faintly of mice. The afternoon light came through the west window and laid itself down on the pine floorboards in a long golden stripe. And I stepped inside, and I was home. The first thing I saw was Grandmother Astrid's crocheted afghan folded over the back of the sofa. It was cream and rust, and the color of new butter worked in a granny square pattern. She had finished it the winter I was 10, and she had told me then, "Eleanor, this is for when you are old, and the world is cold." I had forgotten she had said that. I remembered it now, standing in her parlor, with my purse still on my shoulder. I went to the sofa. I picked up the Afghan. I held it against my face. It smelled of cedar because she had always kept her wool in a cedar chest. And the smell of cedar is the smell of a woman who planned to outlast her wool. I sat down on the sofa. I held the Afghan in my lap. I looked around. The parlor had not changed. The rag rug was the rag rug. The upright piano was the upright piano, its keys yellow as old corn. The bookcase held the same water-damaged atlas and the same dog-eared copy of Kristin Lavransdatter and the same row of Ladies' Home Journal from 1962. On the wall above the piano hung the photograph. It was black and white, 8 inches by 10, in a plain wooden frame, and it showed my grandmother Astrid Vanguard in 1957, standing knee-deep in a flooded bog in rubber waders, her hair in a kerchief, her hands on a wooden scoop, and she was laughing. She was 44 that year. She had just lost my grandfather to a heart attack the previous November, and she had run the bog alone that fall. The man who took the photograph was the county extension agent, and he had put it in the Millbrook Weekly under the caption, "A widow brings in the crop." I had always loved that caption. I had not understood it until that afternoon. I stood up. I walked through the house. The kitchen still had the green linoleum I remembered cracked now, along the seam by the stove. The pantry still had mason jars on the top shelf, empty, dusty, waiting. The back bedroom still had the iron bed with the quilt my great-aunt Ingrid had pieced in 1939. The upstairs smelled of dry wasps and sun-warmed pine. A single bumblebee came in through a gap in the window screen and bumped against the glass and went out again. And I laughed because it was the first laughing sound I had made in 3 weeks, and it surprised me like a sneeze. I did not sleep in the iron bed that first night. I did not have the strength to carry the suitcase up the stairs. I did not have the strength to make the bed. And I did not, frankly, have the strength to be upstairs alone in a house I had not slept in for 11 years. I pulled the crocheted Afghan over me on the parlor sofa. I ate a piece of cheese and an apple I had brought in the car. I listened to the sound of the house settling around me, the creak of the ridge beam, the soft tick of the kitchen clock which had somehow kept running on a battery someone must have changed long after my grandmother died. I listened to the spring peepers start up in the ditch by the road, and I fell asleep with my shoes still on because I could not be bothered to untie them. I woke once in the dark. I did not know where I was. For one long, blank moment, I thought I was in the condominium, and I reached out for Harlan the way you reach without thinking. My hand found the edge of the Afghan instead, and I remembered. I did not cry. I did not go back to sleep quickly. I lay in the dark and listened to the frogs, and I thought, Eleanor, you are alone in a house. That is all. You are alone in a house, and the house is not afraid of you, and you are not afraid of the house. And that is more than many women your age can say tonight. And then I slept. Cordelia came the next morning. I had not called her. I had written her a letter 3 weeks before from the condominium telling her what was happening and where I was going and that I would be all right. And Cordelia Whitmore, who had been my friend since our first week of nursing school in Milwaukee in 1975, had read that letter and had not written back. Because writing back was not her way. Her way was to put a pan of cornbread and a change of clothes and her reading glasses in a canvas bag and drive 3 hours north and park her Buick behind my Volvo at 8:15 in the morning and walk up onto the sagging porch and knock. I opened the door in my bathrobe. I had not brushed my hair. She looked at me. She said, "Eleanor Vanguard, you are a sight." I said, "Cordelia Whitmore, you are a blessing." She said, "I brought cornbread." I said, "Come in." She came in. She set the cornbread on the kitchen table, still warm through the foil. She looked around the kitchen. She said, "Girl, this is going to take some work." I said, "I know." She said, "Well, I brought enough clothes for 2 months. Is that too long?" I sat down on a kitchen chair. I put my face in my hands. And I cried. And Cordelia put her hand on the back of my neck, the way she had done in 1976 when my first patient had died on my shift. And she did not say anything at all. She stayed 2 months. Understand, Cordelia was not a woman who had time to spare. She had 2 grown sons and 4 grandchildren, and a part-time job at the free clinic in Milwaukee. And she had a husband named Marcus who had retired from the post office and who required, as she put it, a certain level of managerial oversight. But she called Marcus that first morning from my kitchen, and I heard her say, "Marcus, I am staying with Eleanor. I do not know for how long. Figure it out. Do not call me about the recycling. I love you." And then she hung up. She cut us each a square of cornbread, and she said, "Now let us see what we are working with." What we were working with was a 100-year-old farmhouse that had been mostly closed up for 11 years. Ever since my grandmother's second cousin had finished settling the estate and handed the keys to Lars. And Lars had not known what to do with it, and had simply paid the taxes and let it sit. The roof was sound. That was the mercy of the whole thing. The well ran. The pump worked. The septic tank had been inspected in 2019 for reasons I never fully understood. But the screen porch was a hazard. The kitchen linoleum was lifting. The back bedroom window had a pane cracked by a fallen branch. The gutters were full of maple samaras turned to pulp. And a family of mice had made a confederation in the pantry that required Cordelia set a treaty rather than a war. We began with the screen porch. Our neighbor, a man named Gunnar Bjornsson, came over the second day with a claw hammer and a box of galvanized screws and a Tupperware of pickled beets. He looked at the sagging porch and he said, "Astrid's granddaughter, is that right?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I am sorry for your grandmother. She was a fine woman. She made the best sour cherry preserves in the county." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Well, let us put a shoulder to this porch before it decides for us." Gunnar Bjornsson was 76 years old, a widower, a retired cranberry cooperative manager, Norwegian on his father's side and German on his mother's. He had lived on the next property for 51 years. He knew every dike and every sluice and every neighbor and every squabble. And he had the gift that very old countrymen have of arriving at your house precisely when you needed him and leaving precisely before you grew tired of him. He did not say much. When he did say something, it mattered. On the third day of porch work, as we were nailing new screen onto the freshly braced frame, he said without looking at me, "Eleanor, you know the bog is grandfathered." I said, "I am sorry." He said, "The bog, your grandmother's bog, it is grandfathered into the Millbrook Farm Registry 1948. No permit required to restart. If the vines are alive, and some of them are, you can bring it back." I stopped nailing. I looked at him. He looked at the screen. He said, "Just so you know." I nodded. I did not say anything. I nailed the next staple with care. He went home for lunch. I sat on the step of the porch. I looked down across the yard at the dormant rectangles of the bog. And I felt for the first time in a long time that something in my chest was interested in tomorrow. The days took on a shape. Cordelia made coffee at 6. I made breakfast. We worked until lunch on whatever the house needed. We took the afternoon slower. I weeded the kitchen garden where my grandmother had grown dill and rhubarb and yellow wax beans. Cordelia scrubbed the floors on her knees because Cordelia did not believe in mops, and she sang while she scrubbed. Old hymns and Roberta Flack, and once a song her mother had sung in Yazoo City in 1948 that she had not remembered until the afternoon light came through the kitchen window at a certain angle. In the evenings we read. I read my grandmother's canning journal, which I had found in the pantry behind a row of empty mason jars, a dark blue cloth-bound notebook in which she had recorded in her neat schoolteacher's hand every batch of jam and jelly and pickles she had put up from 1949 to 2003. And beside each entry she had written a word or two about the weather or the price of sugar or a thing my grandfather had said. And reading it was like hearing her voice in a quiet room. If you are sitting somewhere right now thinking your life is closed and the door has a deadbolt on it and the key is in someone else's pocket, I want you to stay with me for the rest of this story. I am not going to tell you that everything turns out beautiful. I'm going to tell you what happened to me, and you can take from it what fits. About 6 weeks in, on a warm afternoon in late May, Gunnar Bjornsson brought over a jar of his own pickled beets and a pan of rhubarb, crisp his sister had made. He sat on our newly rebuilt screen porch and drank coffee. And after a while he said, "Eleanor, have you been in the scoop shed?" I said, "Not properly." He said, "I would take a look." I said, "What am I looking for?" He said, "I do not know." But Astrid was a woman who kept things, and he did not say another word about it. The next morning I went out to the scoop shed. It was a small building, perhaps 14 feet by 20, clad in weathered cedar shakes with a single door that had settled on its hinges, and a little square window clouded with pollen. Inside it smelled of old wood and cranberry dust and linseed oil. My grandfather's wooden scoops hung on the wall, 6 of them in a row in different sizes. The oldest one dated 1921 in pencil on the handle. There were coils of rope and a stack of wooden harvest boxes and a bench with a vise bolted to it. And under the bench a heap of burlap sacks that had once held seed. I pulled the burlap aside. I did not know what I was looking for. I moved 2 sacks and then a third. And under the third sack, pushed back against the wall, was a tin trunk. It was the size of a small suitcase, painted green once, but the paint was faded to the color of sage. 2 leather straps buckled across the top, and a small brass padlock on the hasp. It was heavier than I expected. I carried it into the house. I set it on the kitchen table. Cordelia came in from the garden with dirt on her knees. She looked at the trunk. She said, "Eleanor." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you have a key?" I said, "I think I do." I went to the parlor. I opened the canning journal. I turned to the back. Taped to the inside of the back cover, where I had not noticed it in weeks of reading, was a small brass key on a twist of red ribbon. And under the key in my grandmother's neat hand were the words, "For Ellie, when the time is right, you will know." I brought the key to the kitchen. My hands were not quite steady. Cordelia stood on the other side of the table. She did not say anything. I put the key in the padlock. The padlock opened. Inside the trunk, wrapped in a piece of red checked oilcloth, were 9 leather ledgers. The oldest dated 1947. The youngest 1989. The record of 42 years of cranberry harvests on the Vanguard bog. Every load, every price, every buyer, every frost warning, every sluice repair. I opened the first ledger. The pages were thick with my grandmother's handwriting. Columns of numbers, dates, yields per acre, market prices per pound, but also notes in the margins. Northeast corner flooded uneven adjust gate. Early frost September 18 vines survived harvest delayed 10 days. New scoop design, wider throat, less spillage. This was not a diary. This was a technical manual written over 4 decades by a woman who had learned her craft one season at a time and had written it down so it would not be lost. I read for an hour. I did not realize I was crying until Cordelia handed me a dish towel. I wiped my face. I said, "She knew." Cordelia said, "She knew what I said, that someone would need this, that someone would come back." Underneath the ledgers in a velvet bag, the color of moss, were 12 gold coins, round and heavy and yellow as butter. I did not know what they were at first. I turned one in my hand. It had a woman's head on one side, Liberty with a coronet, and an eagle on the other. And the date on the one I held was 1901. There were 11 more in different dates between 1879 and 1907. All of them double eagles. All of them real. All of them warm in my palm, as though they had been waiting. Underneath the velvet bag was an envelope. It was sealed. And on the front, in my grandmother's hand, was written, "For my granddaughter Eleanor to be opened when you come home." Inside the envelope was a letter dated October 2004, 7 months before she died. "Ellie," she wrote, "if you are reading this, the house is yours, and I am gone, and you have come home, which I always believed you would, although I did not know when. I want to tell you a few things plainly, because I am a plain woman, and my time for flourishes has passed. The bog is yours. It has been in my family for 3 generations, and it is not a thing I could give to anyone who did not come from it. Your cousin Lars is a good man, but he is a man of towns, and the bog needs a woman who remembers the water. You remember the water, Ellie. I saw it in you when you were 6. The coins are your starting capital. Your grandfather and I saved them over many years, one at a time from the good harvests. And we said to each other that they would be for the one of our blood who needed to start over. I do not know which of you it will be, But whichever of you finds this trunk, I want you to know that I watched you, and I prayed for you, and I trusted that the water would call you home when the time came. Use the coins to start again. Do not use them to mourn. Mourning is free. The ledgers are yours too, so that you will know what a good year looked like and what a bad year looked like, and that both of them passed. The bog has given our family everything, Ellie, and it has asked very little in return. Only hands and patience, and the sense not to flood it when the frost is coming. You have all three of those things. You do not know yet that you have them, but you do. This land rewards competence, not sentiment. Remember that. Your grandmother loves you. Astrid, I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it back in the envelope. I put my head down on the kitchen table between my elbows, and I cried in a way I had not cried for any of the 3 weeks after Harlan served me or any of the 42 years before that. Cordelia stood on the other side of the table. She put her hand on my shoulder. She did not speak. And after a long time, I sat up. I wiped my face on my sleeve. I said, "Cordelia." She said, "I heard." I said, "What do I do?" She said, "Eleanor Vanguard, you do what the woman told you to do. You start again." We did not tell anyone at first. The trunk went under the iron bed in the back bedroom with the Afghan over it. The coins went into a small canvas bank bag inside the trunk. The letter stayed in the envelope, and the envelope stayed on the nightstand, where I could read it on the nights when I needed to, which was most nights for a while. A week later, I drove into Toma and met with a woman named Solveig Esbensen, who had been recommended by Gunnar Bjornsson as the best appraiser in the county. A Norwegian-American woman of 52 with hair the color of wheat and a straight, careful way of speaking. She examined the coins in her back office with a jeweler's loupe and a velvet pad. She weighed each one on a small brass scale. She wrote the dates and the grades in a small notebook. After about 40 minutes, she set down the loupe. She folded her hands on her desk. "Mrs. Vanguard," she said. I said, "Miss Vanguard now, please." She smiled a small smile. "Miss Vanguard, these are 12 genuine United States Liberty Head double eagles minted between 1879 and 1907, in grades ranging from very fine to almost uncirculated. I would be comfortable valuing the set at today's market at approximately $42,000. Perhaps a little more if you chose to sell through a specialty auction house. I would not recommend it. I would recommend a reputable dealer. I can give you 2 names. I nodded. I thanked her. I asked her if she would also look at the bog professionally and give me a sense of what a restored 40-acre cranberry operation might be worth in the Millbrook market. She said, "I am not a farm appraiser, but I know one." She put me in touch with a man named Harold Nielsen from Black River Falls. He came out the following Tuesday in a mud-splashed truck and walked every dike with me for 3 hours. Harold did not talk much. He knelt in the vines. He turned over a mat of runners. He scraped at the dike with his boot. He pulled a small soil probe from his pocket and took core samples from 3 different sections. He said, "Many of your vines are alive, Miss Vanguard. Dormant, but alive. That is unusual after 11 years. Your grandfather did good drainage work. The sluice is functional. The pond at the east end is a good size." He stood up. He brushed the dirt from his knees. He said, "If you restored 3 acres as a test, and they produced at industry average, and you sold to the co-op, you would cover your operating costs the second year. If the whole 40 were restored and it took you 5 or 6 years to get there, the operation at today's valuations would be worth conservatively $310,000, perhaps more." He paused. He looked at me directly. He said, "I would not advise doing it alone. I would advise doing it carefully. And I would advise understanding that the initial investment to restart even 3 acres will be substantial." I said, "How substantial?" He pulled a small notepad from his shirt pocket. He flipped through pages covered in pencil calculations. He said, "For 3 acres, new pump system $12,000, irrigation repairs $8,000, mechanical beater rental or purchase $15,000, frost protection equipment $6,000, herbicide and pest management $4,000, harvest boxes and transport $3,000, licensing and cooperative fees $2,000, labor costs for 1 season $20,000, contingency for repairs and unforeseen issues $15,000. He looked up. He said, $85,000 minimum to do it right. I did not say anything for a moment. I had been thinking in terms of the $15,000 I had saved. Perhaps another 10 from selling a few coins. Harold Nielsen had just told me I needed 6 times that. He said, "Miss Vanguard, I am not trying to discourage you. I am trying to give you real numbers. Most restart operations fail because people underestimate the capital required. They run out of money halfway through the first season, and then they lose everything." I said, "If I had $85,000 and I did everything right, what are my chances?" He thought about that. He said, "If the vines are viable, which they appear to be, if you can pass the state agricultural licensing exam, if you can get cooperative approval, if you can manage frost cycles and pest pressure, if you can hire competent labor, if the market holds, 70%. I said, 70% chance of success. He said, 70% chance of breaking even by year 3, 50% chance of turning a profit by year 5. I thanked him. He gave me his card. He said if I decided to proceed, he knew a few equipment dealers who were honest. And he knew a young man studying agriculture at the technical college who might be interested in seasonal work. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and a calculator and a yellow legal pad. Cordelia sat across from me with a cup of tea. She did not ask questions. She just sat. I did the math 3 times. 12 coins at current appraisal. 42,000. Sell 6 coins. That would give me approximately 21,000. I would need to borrow the remaining 64,000. I had no income. I had no job history for the past 40 years. I had a transitional allowance from Harlan that would last another 9 months. No bank would lend me $64,000 unless. I looked at the ledgers. 42 years of profitable harvests. Documentation of yields. Documentation of market prices. Documentation of a viable operation that had supported my grandparents for 4 decades. I said, "Cordelia, I need to go to a bank." She said, "When?" I said, "Tomorrow." The State Bank of Millbrook was a small brick building on Main Street that had been there since 1923. The loan officer was a woman named Ingrid Solhaug. She was 78 years old. She had worked at the bank for 56 years, and she had known my grandmother. I made an appointment. I brought the ledgers. I brought the appraisal of the coins. I brought Harold Nielsen's estimate. I brought a business plan I had written in longhand on 12 pages of yellow legal paper. Ingrid Solhaug sat across from me in her small office. She had white hair and sharp blue eyes and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime counting money. I said, "Mrs. Solhaug, I need to borrow $60,000 to restart my grandmother's cranberry operation." She said, "Tell me why I should lend it to you." I opened the first ledger. I said, "Because this land produced an average of 14,000 pounds of cranberries per year for 42 consecutive years. Because the vines are still alive. Because I have 21,000 in startup capital from the sale of assets. Because I have documentation of market viability going back to 1947. And because I am willing to put the entire property up as collateral." She looked at the ledgers. She turned pages slowly. She made notes on a pad of paper. After 20 minutes, she looked up. She said, "Eleanor Vanguard, I remember you. You used to come here with your grandmother in the summers. You were a serious little girl. You always said, 'Please' and 'thank you.'" I said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Your grandmother, Astrid, was the toughest woman I ever met. She ran that bog alone for 30 years after your grandfather died. She never missed a payment. She never asked for extensions. She brought her harvest in every October, and she paid her debts, and she did not complain." She closed the ledger. She said, "I will lend you the 60,000, 5-year note, 6% interest. First payment due 1 year from now to give you time to establish production. But I want 2 things from you." I said, "What?" She said, "1, you pass the state agricultural licensing exam within 90 days. I will not lend money to someone who cannot prove technical competence. 2, you get written approval from the Millbrook Cranberry Cooperative. If they will not take your harvest, you have no market." I said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" I said, "Yes." She stood up. She held out her hand. I shook it. Her grip was firm. She said, "Your grandmother would be proud of you for trying. She would be prouder if you succeed. Do not waste her land." I said, "I won't." I walked out of the bank with a signed promissory note and a list of conditions I had 90 days to meet. Cordelia was waiting in the Volvo. I got in. I handed her the note. She read it. She said, "Well." I said, "I have 90 days to pass an agricultural exam I have never studied for and convince a cooperative of old farmers that a 69-year-old woman who has not worked a bog in 50 years knows what she is doing." She said, "So we should get started." The Wisconsin Agricultural Licensing Exam covered soil science hydrology, pest management, frost protection systems, organic certification standards, and cooperative law. The study materials were 400 pages long. I read them twice. I made flashcards. I stayed up until 2 in the morning memorizing pH levels and nitrogen cycles and the life stages of the cranberry fruitworm. Cordelia quizzed me while we worked on the house. What is the optimal soil pH for cranberry cultivation? Between 4.0 and 5.5. Correct. What is the primary vector for false blossom disease? Blunt-nosed leafhopper. Correct. Gunnar Bjornsson came over in the evenings. He did not offer to help me study. He offered to test me. He would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and he would say, "Eleanor, tell me the optimal water depth for early black variety in October." And I would say, 18 inches for beater harvest, 12 inches for dry harvest. And he would say, "Why?" And I would have to explain the physics of it, the way the berries float, the way the beater loosens them from the vine without damaging the fruit, the way the depth affects the efficiency of collection. If I got it wrong, he did not correct me gently. He said, "No. Think about it. What happens to the vines if the water is too deep?" And I would have to reason my way to the answer. Oxygen deprivation, root damage, delayed dormancy. It was not kind, but it was effective. I took the exam on a Tuesday morning in early July at the county extension office in Sparta. There were 6 other people in the room, all of them men, all of them younger than me by at least 20 years. They looked at me the way you look at someone who has wandered into the wrong room. The exam was 3 hours long, multiple choice and short answer, and 2 essay questions about integrated pest management and water rights law. I finished with 20 minutes to spare. I handed in my test booklet. The proctor said results would be mailed within 2 weeks. I drove home. I did not feel confident. I did not feel uncertain. I felt empty. The way you feel when you have prepared for something as hard as you can, and now the outcome is out of your hands. Cordelia was on the porch when I got back. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Did you answer every question?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you did what you could." The results came 9 days later. A single sheet of paper in a state of Wisconsin envelope. I opened it standing at the mailbox at the end of the lane. Cordelia had walked down with me. She stood 3 feet away and did not ask to see it. The letter said, "Eleanor Vanguard, score 91, status pass. License number WI-AG-47239, valid through July 2029. I looked at Cordelia. I said 91. She said 91 out of what? I said 100. She said, "Well then." I said, "Well then." We walked back to the house. I did not feel triumphant. I felt steady. There is a difference, and the difference matters. Triumph is a spike in the blood. Steady is a low, warm light under the sternum, and it lasts longer, and it is harder to take away. The Millbrook Cranberry Cooperative met on the 2nd Thursday of every month in the basement of the Lutheran Church on Main Street. Gunnar Bjornsson told me I should attend the August meeting. He said, "You will need to introduce yourself. You will need to present your plan, and you will need to answer their questions." He said, "They will not make it easy." I said, "I don't expect them to." There were 14 members of the cooperative, 13 men and 1 woman. The woman was 71 and ran a 30-acre operation with her 2 sons. The men ranged from 48 to 83. They had been farming cranberries for a combined 417 years. I sat in a folding chair in the back of the room while they conducted regular business, voting on a new sorting facility, discussing a contract dispute with a buyer in Massachusetts, reviewing pest management protocols for the coming season. And then the chairman, a man named Olaf Hendrickson, said, "We have a visitor, Eleanor Vanguard, Astrid Vanguard's granddaughter. She wants to restart the old Vanguard bog. Eleanor, would you like to say a few words?" Duh. I stood up. I walked to the front of the room. I had prepared notes. I did not use them. I said, "My name is Eleanor Vanguard. I am 69 years old. I am restarting my grandmother's 40-acre cranberry operation. I have passed the state agricultural licensing exam. I have secured financing. I am beginning with a 3-acre test plot this season. If I am successful, I will expand to full production over the next 5 years. I am asking for provisional membership in this cooperative so that I have a market for my harvest." Olaf Hendrickson said, "What is your experience?" I said, "I worked my grandmother's bog as a child from age 6 to age 12. I have not worked a bog since. But I have spent the last 8 weeks studying my grandmother's ledgers, 42 years of harvest records. And I have spent the last 6 weeks studying soil science and hydrology and pest management. And I scored 91 on the state exam." A man in the third row said, "That doesn't mean you can run a bog." I said, "You're right. It means I understand the principles. Running it successfully will depend on execution." Another man said, "Who is going to do the labor? You can't harvest 3 acres alone." I said, "I have hired a student from the technical college in Wisconsin Rapids, Soren Halverson. He will work weekends and full-time during harvest, and I will be working alongside him." The woman in the front row said, "At 69, I said, at 69. Olaf Hendrickson said, "We have never had a restart operation succeed after more than 5 years dormant. Yours has been dormant for 11. I said, "I know." He said, "Why do you think you will be different?" I said, "Because my grandmother kept records. Because the vines are still alive. Because I am not doing this as a hobby. I am doing this because it is the only thing I have left. And I do not intend to fail." There was a long silence. Then Gunnar Bjornsson stood up. He said, "I have been working with Eleanor for the past 6 weeks. I have tested her on frost cycles and water management and vine health. She knows her material. I propose we give her provisional membership. 1 year. If her harvest meets cooperative quality standards, we vote again on full membership." Olaf Hendrickson said, "All in favor." 8 hands went up. He said, "Opposed," 5 hands. He said, "Motion carries. Eleanor Vanguard, you have provisional membership. Your test plot harvest will be evaluated in October. If it meets our standards, you can sell through the cooperative. If it does not, this membership is revoked. Do you understand?" I said, "I understand." I sat down. My hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from something else. From the understanding that I had just committed myself to something I could not take back. After the meeting, 3 of the men who had voted against me left without speaking. But the woman in the front row came up to me. She said, "My name is Ingrid Torvog. I run the Torvog operation east of town. If you need advice, you can call me. Not because I think you will succeed, because I want to see what happens when you try." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. Thank me in October if you bring in a harvest." I sold 3 of the gold coins the next day to a reputable dealer in Madison. He gave me $10,500 for them, which was, he said, fair market value given the condition. I kept 9 coins in the bank bag under the iron bed. Some inheritances are for now. Some are for later. I had decided I would not spend the later in advance. Soren Halverson came to the farm on a Saturday in mid-August. He was 23 years old, tall and quiet with pale hair, and the kind of hands that had done manual work. He was studying agricultural systems at Wisconsin Rapids, and he was looking for practical experience and seasonal income. I showed him the 3-acre plot we would be restoring, the northeast corner where the vines looked healthiest, where the drainage was best, where my grandmother's ledgers showed the most consistent yields. He walked the plot with me. He knelt in the vines the way Harold Nielsen had done. He said, "These vines are alive. That's good. But they need work. We will need to mow the mat, clear the dikes, repair the sluice, test the irrigation. You understand this is going to be hard labor." I said, "I understand." He said, "And you are going to be working alongside me." I said, "Every day you are here." He nodded. He said, "All right. When do we start?" I said, "Monday." We worked 6 days a week. Soren came at 7 in the morning and stayed until 5. Cordelia managed the business side, permits and insurance and supplier contracts. She set up a filing system in the parlor with labeled folders for every aspect of the operation. She was, as she put it, providing organizational infrastructure. I worked the bog. I learned the names of things I had forgotten. I had learned as a child. I learned the smell of wet peat on a warm morning. I learned the ache in my lower back at the end of a day, and the way that ache was, to my great surprise, a kind of friend. We mowed the mat of dormant runners gently with a blade my grandfather had bought in 1962. Gunnar Bjornsson sharpened it for me on his own grinder. The mowing was delicate work. Too aggressive and you damage the vines. Too timid and you leave too much dead material that will rot and harbor disease. Soren ran the mower. I walked behind and raked the cuttings. We moved slowly. An acre a week, and the bog began to look like something that could produce fruit again. We cleared willow and alder from the dikes. We repaired a section of the sluice with new oak planks. We tested the irrigation system and found 2 pipes that had cracked over the winter. We replaced them. In early September, Gunnar came over and said, "Eleanor, you need to start thinking about frost." I said, "It's still summer." He said, "Frost does not wait for the calendar. What is your plan if we get an early freeze?" I opened my grandmother's ledger to September 1979. I showed him the entry. Early frost, September 18th. Vines survived. Used sprinkler system overnight. Harvest delayed 10 days. Gunnar said, "So you know the technique?" I said, "In theory." He said, "Theory is not enough. Let me show you." He took me out to the 3-acre plot. He explained the physics of it, how a thin layer of ice forming on the vines can actually protect them if the water keeps flowing. How the latent heat of freezing releases energy that keeps the vine tissue from dropping below 32 degrees. He said, but if you stop the water too soon or if you use too much pressure and knock the berries off, you lose the crop. It is a narrow window, and you have to be awake to manage it. I said, how will I know when? He said, you watch the sky, you watch the thermometer, and you learn to feel it in the air, the way your grandmother did. On the night of September 15th, the temperature dropped to 34 degrees. I woke at 3 in the morning. I went outside in my bathrobe. The air had that particular stillness that comes before frost. No wind. The stars very bright. I went back inside. I made coffee. I watched the thermometer on the porch. At 4:15 it read 33 degrees. At 4:30 it read 32. I called Soren. I said, we have frost coming. Can you get here? He said, 20 minutes. I dressed. I went out to the bog. I started the sprinkler system the way Gunnar had shown me. The water arced over the vines in fine streams. In the darkness, I could see the droplets catching the light from the barn. Soren arrived. We walked the plot together. We adjusted the sprinkler heads. We made sure every vine was getting coverage. At 5:30, the sun came up. The temperature had dropped to 29 degrees. The vines were coated in a thin shell of ice, but underneath the ice, the water was still flowing, and the vines were alive. We kept the sprinklers running until 8, until the temperature climbed back above freezing. Then we shut the system down. I knelt in the vines. I examined the berries. They were firm, red, undamaged. We had not lost a single one. Soren said, you did it. I said, we did it. He said, no, you made the call. You knew when to start the water. That was not in any textbook. But it was. It was in my grandmother's ledger. It was in the entry from 1979 where she had written, you will feel it in the air. Trust yourself. 2 weeks later, on the night of September 29th, the phone rang at 10 o'clock. I almost did not answer it, but something made me pick up. The voice on the other end said, Eleanor. It was Harlan. I had not heard his voice in 5 months. It sounded older than I remembered, which was strange because it had only been 5 months. He said, Eleanor, I hope I am not interrupting. I said, you are not. He said, I wanted to tell you. I may have been hasty. He stopped. He tried again. He said that word carefully, as though it were a small glass object he was setting on a shelf. I may have been hasty, he said. Blythe and I, we are taking some time. Perhaps you and I could talk. I stood at the kitchen sink. There was a bowl of cranberries on the counter. I had picked them that afternoon from the test plot, just a handful, to see if they were ripe. They were the color of garnets. I did not say anything for a long moment. I could hear his breath on the other end of the line, a little uneven. And I could hear faintly a television in the background. And I thought, he is alone in the condominium. He is alone in our condominium, which is his condominium. And he is afraid. And I am not the answer to his fear. I have been the answer to his fear for 42 years. and I will not be the answer to it for one more hour. I said, Harlan, I hope you are well. I am sorry for whatever is happening in your life. I wish you peace, but I am not going to talk to you. Please do not call again. Then I said goodbye quietly, because I do not believe in slamming receivers. And I put the phone back on its cradle, and I picked up one of the cranberries from the bowl. I held it up to the light. It was perfect, firm, the skin unbroken, the color deep and true. And I thought, this is what I have built. This small, perfect thing that I grew with my own hands. I went to bed that night, and I slept 7 hours, which was more than I had slept in any night in Chicago for about 3 years. The next morning, I took a postcard from the drawer of the parlor desk. It was an old one from a box my grandmother had kept for decades. A picture of the Millbrook Cranberry Festival from 1978. A little faded, a little ridiculous. I wrote on the back in my neatest hand, Harlan number, be well, E. I addressed it to his office, not to the condominium, because I did not want Blythe, if Blythe was still there, to read it and feel wounded. I walked it to the mailbox at the end of the lane. I lifted the red flag. I walked back to the house. That was the last communication Harlan and I ever had. But it was not the last I would hear from him. The letter from Harlan's attorney arrived on the first Tuesday of October, 3 weeks before harvest. It was delivered by certified mail, which meant I had to sign for it, which meant the postal carrier knew it was important, which meant by evening half of Millbrook would know that Eleanor Vanguard had received legal papers. The letter was 6 pages long. It was written in the language lawyers use when they want to make simple things sound complicated. But the core of it was this. Harlan Vanguard was claiming the Millbrook property as a marital asset. He was arguing that although the land had been inherited by Eleanor during the marriage, it had been maintained with marital funds and therefore constituted joint property, subject to equitable distribution. The letter cited tax payments made from joint accounts between 2013 and 2024. It cited insurance premiums. It cited a fence repair in 2017 that Lars had commissioned and billed to the estate account, which had been funded by contributions from both Harlan and Eleanor. The letter requested immediate mediation. Failing that, it promised litigation. I read the letter twice. Then I set it on the kitchen table. Cordelia was at the stove making soup. She turned around. She said, "What is it?" I said, "Harlan is suing me for the farm." She came to the table. She read the letter. She said a word I had only heard her use twice in 49 years of friendship. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I'm going to call a lawyer, and then I'm going to finish preparing for harvest, because if I lose this crop, none of it matters anyway." I called Martha Svensson that afternoon. She was a lawyer in Sparta, 58 years old, Norwegian-American. She had a reputation for being tough and fair and expensive. Gunnar Bjornsson had recommended her with the words, "Martha does not lose." I met with her the next day. I brought the letter. I brought the deed to the property showing it had been left to me in my grandmother's will. I brought bank statements showing the tax and insurance payments had come from an estate account, not from marital funds. I brought documentation that Lars had managed the property as executor, and that any maintenance costs had been charged to the estate. Not to me personally. Martha read everything. She made notes on a yellow legal pad. After an hour, she looked up. She said, "Eleanor, this is a nuisance suit. Your ex-husband's attorney knows he has weak standing. The property was inherited. It was managed through a separate estate. The only marital funds that touched it were indirect contributions to the estate account over the years, and those were minimal." I said, "So he will lose?" She said, "Probably, but probably is not definitely. And even a weak suit can tie up property for months, years, if he wants to drag it out. Is that what concerns you?" I said, "I have invested $85,000 in restarting this farm, 60,000 of it borrowed. If this land is tied up in litigation, I cannot use it as collateral. If I cannot use it as collateral, the bank can call the loan. If the bank calls the loan, I lose everything." Martha nodded. She said, "Then we need to move quickly. I will file a motion to dismiss based on lack of standing. I will request an expedited hearing. But Eleanor, you need to understand something. The judge is going to look at this and see a 69-year-old woman with no income trying to run a farm. And he is going to wonder if you are competent to manage it independently. That is what your ex-husband's lawyer is counting on." I said, "What do I need to do?" She said, "Bring in your harvest. Prove you can operate this land profitably. Show the court you are not dependent on anyone. Show them competence." The hearing was scheduled for the second week of November, which meant it would happen 2 weeks after harvest, which meant everything depended on the next 4 weeks. I went home. I told Cordelia. She said, "Well, we had better make sure this harvest is perfect." I said, "It has to be more than perfect. It has to be undeniable." We worked every day. Soren came at dawn. We walked the 3 acres. We checked every vine. We tested the berries for firmness. We monitored the sugar content with a refractometer Gunnar had lent me. We watched the weather forecasts like they were prophecies. On the 10th of October, a man in a gray suit came to the farm. He parked a black sedan in my driveway. He walked up to the porch. He knocked. I opened the door. He said, "Miss Vanguard, my name is James Kellerman. I represent Lakeside Development Corporation. We have made an offer on this property. I understand you declined. I wanted to discuss it with you personally." I said, "I am not interested." He said, "You have not heard the new terms. $420,000. Cash. Closing in 30 days. You would walk away with enough to retire comfortably. No more worrying about harvests. No more legal battles with your ex-husband." I said, "How do you know about the legal battle?" He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. He said, "Miss Vanguard, this is a small county. People talk. And people are concerned about you. A woman your age taking on this kind of risk. It does not seem wise." I said, "Mr. Kellerman, I am not selling. Not for $420,000. Not for any amount. This land is not for sale. Please leave." He said, "Miss Vanguard, let me be clear. This development is going to happen. We already own 3 adjacent properties. Yours is in the middle. If you do not sell, we will make life very difficult for you. Access roads, water rights, zoning challenges. You will spend the next 5 years in court fighting battles you cannot win." I said, Then I will spend the next 5 years fighting. But I will not sell. Get off my property." He left, but I knew he would be back. And I knew he meant what he said. 3 days later, on the morning of October 13th, I woke at 4 to check the irrigation system. It was my routine. Every morning before dawn, I would walk the plot and make sure the sprinklers were ready in case of frost. But when I got to the 3-acre plot, I knew immediately something was wrong. The ground was wet, not from dew, from flooding. Someone had opened the sluice gate. The water from the creek had poured into the bog overnight. The vines were submerged under 2 feet of water. In October, 3 weeks before harvest, too much water and the berries would split. Too much water and the vines would develop root rot. Too much water and we would lose the entire crop. I ran back to the house. I called Soren. I said, "Someone sabotaged the sluice. We are flooded. I need you here now." He said, 15 minutes. I called Gunnar. I woke him. I said, "Gunnar, the bog is flooded. 2 feet. I need help." He said, "I am coming." I went back out to the plot. I waded into the water. It was cold. It came up past my knees. I reached the sluice gate at the far end. The wooden planks we had installed in August had been pried loose. The gate was wide open. Water was still pouring through. I tried to close it, but the mechanism was jammed. Someone had driven a steel wedge into the gate frame. I could not move it alone. Soren arrived. Then Gunnar. Then Cordelia. Then, to my surprise, Rowan and her husband, Callum. They had driven up from Madison overnight because Cordelia had called them. Callum looked at the sluice. He said, "I can fix this, but I need tools, and I need time." Gunnar said, "We do not have time. Every hour this water sits on the vines increases the damage." I said, "Then we drain it manually. Pumps, buckets, whatever we have." We worked for 8 hours. Callum cut the wedge out of the sluice with a hacksaw. He repaired the gate mechanism with spare parts from Gunnar's shed. Soren and I set up 3 portable pumps and ran them at full capacity. Rowan and Cordelia bailed water with 5-gallon buckets. By noon, the water level had dropped to 6 inches. By 3, it was gone. We stood in the mud and looked at the vines. Gunnar knelt. He examined the berries. He turned them over in his hands. He said, "Some splitting, maybe 10% loss. The rest looks salvageable. But you will need to harvest earlier than planned. The stress will accelerate ripening. I would say 1 week, not 3. I said, 1 week. He said, 1 week, or you lose it all. That night I called the county sheriff. I filed a report. I described the sabotage. I gave him James Kellerman's name. The sheriff took notes. He said he would look into it. But his voice had the tone of a man who knows he will not find evidence. I did not sleep that night. I sat on the porch and watched the bog. Cordelia came out at 2 in the morning. She sat beside me. She said, "Eleanor, you should rest." I said, "I cannot rest. In 1 week, I have to bring in a harvest that will determine whether I keep this land or lose everything. And someone is actively trying to destroy me." She said, "Then we make sure they fail." The next 7 days were the hardest work I have ever done. We flooded the 3 acres on October 15th. Not the slow, gentle flood I had planned. A rapid flood because we did not have time for slow. We brought the water up to 18 inches in 24 hours. The berries floated to the surface, red against the dark water, like a field of rubies. On the morning of October 16th, we began the harvest. Soren operated the mechanical beater. It was a small unit we had rented from the co-op. A paddle system that agitates the vines, gently loosening the berries without damaging them. He moved through the water slowly. The beater churned. The berries released. They drifted to the surface in clouds of red. Rowan and Callum worked the booms, long floating barriers that corral the berries into collection areas. They worked in waders moving through the cold water with the steady patience of people who understand that this work cannot be rushed. Gunnar and I worked the scoops, the wooden scoops my grandfather had made. We lifted the berries in great wet, heavy loads and transferred them to the harvest boxes on the bank. The work was repetitive. Scoop, lift, pour, scoop, lift, pour. My back ached. My hands cramped. The cold water numbed my legs. But I did not stop. None of us stopped. We worked from dawn until the light failed. And then we worked by lantern. And then we worked by moonlight. At midnight on the second day, Cordelia brought thermoses of coffee and sandwiches out to the bog. We sat on the dike and ate. Nobody spoke. We were too tired for speaking. On the third day, Rowan said, "Mom, how much more?" I said, "Half." She said, "You are going to destroy yourself." I said, "I'm going to finish." By the evening of the fourth day, we had harvested the entire 3 acres. The berries lay in wooden boxes, stacked on pallets near the shed. We counted them on my grandfather's old scale, the kind with the balance arm and the sliding weights. 1,847 pounds. 1,847 pounds of cranberries from 3 acres, from vines that had been dormant for 11 years. Soren checked the numbers on his calculator. He said, "That is 615 pounds per acre. Eleanor, that is phenomenal. Industry average is 450. Gunnar stood beside me. He was quiet. Finally, he said, "I have been farming cranberries for 53 years. My best yield this season was 583 pounds per acre." He paused. He looked at the boxes. He said, "You beat me." With 11-year dormant vines. That is not luck. That is mastery. We loaded the cranberries into Soren's truck. We covered them with tarps. We drove them to the co-op processing facility in Millbrook. It was 9 o'clock on a Friday night in October. The facility was closed, but Ingrid Torvog had agreed to meet us there. She unlocked the building. She turned on the lights. She looked at the boxes in the truck bed. She said, "Let us see what you have." We carried the boxes inside. She weighed them on the industrial scale. She took samples from 5 different boxes. She examined the berries under bright light. She tested them for firmness, for color, for size, for the presence of rot or pest damage. After 30 minutes, she made notes on a clipboard. She signed a form. She handed me a copy. It said, "Vanguard Eleanor, Millbrook, Wisconsin, Year 1, Total weight 1,847 pounds. Grade A. Quality Index 94. Cooperative market rate $6.50 per pound. Gross value $12,005.50. She looked at me. She said, 94% grade A. Eleanor, that is exceptional, especially for a restart operation. I said, will the co-op take it? She said, the co-op will take it, and I will personally recommend your full membership at the November meeting. You have earned it. I stood in the processing facility with the receipt in my hand. Cordelia was beside me. Rowan was beside me. Soren and Callum and Gunnar were there. And I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like I belonged somewhere. The cooperative meeting was held on November 7th, 2 days before my court hearing. I attended with my receipt and my license and a quiet determination to say as little as possible. But Gunnar Bjornsson stood up during the membership review. He said, I want to make a statement about Eleanor Vanguard's harvest. The room went quiet. Gunnar did not often make statements. He said, Eleanor Vanguard brought in 615 pounds per acre from vines that were dormant for 11 years. My best yield this season was 583 pounds per acre. I have been farming cranberries in this valley for 53 years. I know my craft. Eleanor beat me. She did not beat me through luck. She beat me through competence. He looked around the room. He said, she studied her grandmother's ledgers. She passed the state exam with a 91. She managed a sabotage attempt that would have destroyed most operations. She brought in a grade A harvest under conditions that would have broken lesser farmers. I propose full membership, effective immediately. Olaf Hendrickson said, all in favor. 13 hands went up, 1 abstention. He said, motion carries. Eleanor Vanguard, you are a full member of the Millbrook Cranberry Cooperative. Welcome. I went home that night and I sat on the porch and I looked out at the dark rectangles of the bog. And I thought about what Gunnar had said. She beat me through competence, not through sympathy, not through sentiment, through competence, through work, through the willingness to learn and the discipline to execute what I had learned. That was what mattered. That was what would always matter. The court hearing was held on November 9th in the county courthouse in Sparta. Martha Svensson and I sat on one side of a long table. Harlan and his attorney, Gerald Hartman, sat on the other side. The judge was a woman named Catherine Reeves, 62 years old. She had a reputation for impatience with time wasting. Gerald Hartman presented his case. He argued that the Millbrook property had been enhanced with marital funds. He cited the tax payments. He cited the insurance premiums. He suggested that Eleanor's attempt to restart the farm was proof that she viewed it as a marital asset worth developing. Martha responded. She presented the deed. She presented the estate account records showing all maintenance costs had been paid from non-marital funds. She presented my harvest receipt. She presented my co-op membership certificate. She presented a letter from Ingrid Solhaug at the state bank confirming the loan and noting that I had been approved based on independent financial viability. Judge Reeves looked at the documents. She looked at Harlan. She said, Mr. Vanguard, when did you first express interest in this property? Harlan said, Your Honor, I have always supported my wife's connection to her family land. The judge said, That is not what I asked. When did you first claim ownership interest? Harlan hesitated. Gerald Hartman leaned over and whispered something. Harlan said, "After the divorce filing, Your Honor." The judge said, "After 42 years of marriage, during which time this property sat vacant, you claim ownership interest only after your ex-wife has invested $85,000 in making it viable." Gerald Hartman said, "Your Honor, the timing is not relevant to the legal question of whether marital funds were used." Judge Reeves said, "Mr. Hartman, the timing is entirely relevant to the question of whether this claim has merit or whether it is harassment. I have reviewed the estate account records. The contributions from marital funds over 11 years total less than $4,000. Mrs. Vanguard, is that correct?" Martha said, "Miss Vanguard, Your Honor." And yes, that is correct. Judge Reeves said, "Miss Vanguard has invested $85,000 of her own capital and borrowed funds to develop this property. She has obtained state licensing. She has obtained cooperative membership. She has produced a harvest that, according to the co-op certification, meets professional quality standards. This is not a woman who is dependent on marital assets. This is a woman who has established an independent, viable operation." She closed the folder. She said, "Mr. Vanguard, your claim is dismissed. The Millbrook property is separate property belonging entirely to Eleanor Vanguard. You have no standing to claim any interest in it. Furthermore, I am awarding costs to the defendant. You will reimburse Miss Vanguard for her legal fees in defending this frivolous suit. We are adjourned." She stood up. We stood up. Harlan sat very still. He looked at me across the table. His eyes were the same blue they had always been, but there was something different in them now. Not anger, recognition. The recognition that he had underestimated me for 42 years. I did not say anything to him. I walked out of the courtroom with Martha. Outside on the courthouse steps, she said, "Eleanor, you won." I said, "I know." She said, "You understand what just happened. You proved to a court of law that you can operate independently, that you have competence, that you are not the dependent spouse he made you into." I said, "I proved it to myself first. The court was secondary." I drove home. Cordelia was waiting on the porch. She said, "Well," I said, "I won. The farm is mine. Harlan has to pay my legal fees. It is over." She said, "It is not over. It is beginning." 3 weeks later, on a cold afternoon in early December, a car pulled into my driveway. I was in the scoop shed organizing equipment for winter storage. I looked out the small window and saw Harlan getting out of a Mercedes. He walked to the shed. He knocked on the door frame. I opened the door. I said, "Harlan." He said, "Eleanor, may I speak with you?" I said, "For a few minutes." He came inside. He looked around the shed, at the wooden scoops on the wall, at the workbench, at the coils of rope. He said, "I did not know you knew how to do any of this." I said, "I did not know either. I learned." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor, I came to apologize for the lawsuit, for underestimating you, for 42 years of taking you for granted. I said, "All right." He said, "I have been thinking. Blythe is gone. The practice is gone. I retired last month. I have nothing. And I thought perhaps I could help you here. I could learn. I could work. I need purpose, Eleanor. I need to build something again." I looked at him. He looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically smaller, but diminished. The way a man looks when he has lost the thing that defined him, and he does not know what he is without it. I said, "Harlan, no." He said, "Eleanor, please, I am asking. I am not demanding. I am asking for a chance." I said, "Harlan, you cannot find purpose through me. Not anymore. You did that for 42 years, and it did not work for either of us. If you want purpose, you have to build it yourself." He said, "I do not know how." I said, "Then you learn, the same way I learn. You study, you work, you fail, you try again, you earn it." I went to the workbench. I opened a drawer. I pulled out a folder. Inside were photocopies of Harold Nielsen's contact information and the state agricultural licensing exam study materials. I handed it to Harlan. I said, "If you want to build something, build your own cranberry bog. There is land for sale in Waushara County, 40 acres, dormant for 8 years. The owner died and the heirs want to sell. I was going to pass on it because I do not have the capital to expand yet, but you do. You have retirement money. You have the settlement from the practice." He looked at the folder. He said, "You want me to start my own farm?" I said, "I want you to earn your dignity back. And you cannot do that by working for me. You can do it by doing what I did. Learning a craft, building something with your own hands, proving to yourself that you are more than the mistakes you made." He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "I do not know if I can." I said, I did not know if I could either. But I tried. And that is the difference between the man you were and the man you could be. He took the folder. He said, "Eleanor, will you help me? If I try this, will you answer questions? Will you show me what you learned?" I said, "If you ask respectfully. If you do the work. If you prove you are serious. Then yes. I will help you the way Gunnar helped me. Not by making it easy. By making you earn it." He nodded. He said, "Thank you." I said, "Do not thank me yet. Thank me when you bring in your first harvest. If you bring in your first harvest." He left. I watched him drive away. And I thought about the morning he had handed me the folder. The morning I had thought my life was ending. I had been so wrong. My life had not been ending. It had been starting. For the first time. 5 years passed. I am 74 years old now. I am writing this from the porch of my grandmother's farmhouse. The sun is setting over the bog, all 40 acres of it, fully restored, fully operational. It took me 5 years to do what I said I would do. The first year was the 3-acre test plot. The second year I expanded to 10 acres. The third year to 20. The fourth year to 35. The fifth year I completed the full 40. Last season I brought in 24,000 pounds of cranberries. Grade A. Sold through the co-op at market rate. Revenue of $183,000. Operating costs of $97,000. Net profit of $86,000. I paid off the bank loan in year 4. I sold 3 more gold coins to finance the final expansion. I have 6 coins left in the bank bag under the iron bed. Some inheritances are still for later. Soren Halverson is 28 now. He graduated from the technical college and came to work for me full-time. I pay him a salary. I am training him in the craft the way Gunnar trained me. He will take over this operation when I am too old to run it. Gunnar's grandson Magnus works with us 3 days a week. He is 29. He is learning the business side. Between the two of them, they will keep this land producing for another generation. Rowan comes up from Madison every other weekend. She brings her family. She walks the bog with me and we talk about things we could not talk about when I was married to her father. She told me last year, "Mom, watching you build this taught me more about resilience than my entire psychology degree." Cordelia visits once a month. She and Marcus bought a small cabin on a lake 20 miles north. She says she is retired now, but she still manages my bookkeeping. She says it keeps her sharp. I became the first woman elected to the Millbrook Cranberry Cooperative Board of Directors in the organization's 75-year history. I serve on the Marketing Committee and the Technical Standards Committee. The old men who voted against me in that church basement 7 years ago now ask for my advice on frost management and vine health. I consult for 3 other restart operations in Wisconsin. I teach them what my grandmother taught me. I give them copies of her ledgers. I tell them this land rewards competence, not sentiment. Harlan bought the Waushara County property. He spent 2 years learning the craft. He failed his first licensing exam. He passed on the second try. He brought in his first harvest in year 3. It was small, modest, but it was his. He called me the night he sold it to the co-op. He said, "Eleanor, I did it. I brought in 800 pounds. Grade B, but I did it." I said, "Good. Now do it again and make it better." We are not friends. We will never be friends. But we have a kind of respect now. The respect that comes from understanding that we both had to learn how to build lives that were truly ours. Gunnar Bjornsson died in the spring of this year. He was 81 years old. He died in his sleep, peacefully, the way old farmers hope to die. His family asked me to speak at the funeral. I stood at the pulpit in the Lutheran church where I had defended my plan to the co-op 7 years before. And I said, "Gunnar Bjornsson taught me that farming is not about the land. It is about earning the right to work the land." I said, he did not make it easy for me. He tested me. He challenged me. He made me prove I was serious. And when I proved it, he gave me the greatest gift anyone ever gave me. He gave me his respect. After the service, his daughter came up to me. She handed me a wooden box. She said, "My father wanted you to have this." I opened the box. Inside was the 1921 wooden scoop. My grandfather's scoop. The one Gunnar had sharpened for me 7 years ago. The one we had used to harvest the first crop. There was a note tucked inside, in Gunnar's handwriting. It said, "Eleanor, to the only one who mastered it, use it well. Teach the next one. GB." I took the scoop home. I hung it on the wall in the scoop shed, next to my grandfather's other scoops. and I thought about legacy, about what we pass down, about what we leave behind. My grandmother Astrid left me 12 gold coins and 42 years of ledgers, and a letter that said I would know when the time was right. She was correct. I did know. But she left me something else too. Something she could not put in a trunk or write in a letter. She left me the example of a woman who ran a bog alone for 30 years after her husband died and never missed a harvest. She left me the knowledge that strength is not something you are born with. It is something you build. Season by season, row by row, scoop by scoop. I am 74 years old. People ask me when I will retire. I tell them I am not building this to retire from it. I am building this to leave behind. On my 75th birthday, I am going to add a stone marker at the edge of the bog. It will say Vanguard Cranberry Farm, established 1947, restored 2024, 3 generations, counting. Because Soren will run it when I cannot, and someone will run it after Soren, and the ledgers will grow, and the coins that remain will wait for the next person who needs to start over. This morning I walked the 40 acres, all of them. The vines are dormant now. Winter is settling in. The bog is the color of dried blood against the snow. But underneath the dormancy, the roots are alive, waiting for spring, waiting for the water. I stood at the sluice gate where we repaired the sabotage 7 years ago. I thought about that morning. The panic, the cold water, the certainty that I was going to lose everything. I did not lose everything. I gained everything. Not because I was lucky, not because people felt sorry for me, because I learned a craft, because I executed what I learned, because I earned the respect of people who do not give respect easily. At 69, I thought my life was over. I thought I was too old to start, too old to learn, too old to build something from nothing. I was wrong about all of it. 69 is not a finished sentence. It is a colon. The first half tells you what came before. The second half is what you decide to write, and you may have less time to write it than you had for the first half. But that does not mean the second half is less. If you are reading this and you are where I was that April morning in the North Shore condominium, I want you to hear me clearly. The door has not closed. The key is not in someone else's pocket. Your grandmother or your grandfather or some person of your blood buried a trunk for you somewhere. Maybe it is not a tin trunk. Maybe it is a skill you forgot you had. Maybe it is a dream you put away. Maybe it is a piece of land. Maybe it is just the knowledge that you are more than the person someone else needed you to be. Your job at whatever age you are is to go find it. You will know the key when you see it. You will know the water when you stand in it. You will know your own home when the door swings open and the light lays itself down on the floor. And you think, oh, I am home. The cranberries are asleep under the snow now. The porch light is on. The Afghan is folded on the sofa where my grandmother left it. And I am at last exactly where I was always meant to be. Not because someone gave it to me, because I built it. With these hands, with this knowledge, with this discipline. That is the legacy, not the land, not the coins. The knowledge that competence is the only currency that matters. That respect must be earned. That you are never too old to start. And that the second half of your life can be the part where you finally become who you were meant to be all along. Good night from Millbrook. The bog is quiet. The work is done. And tomorrow we begin again.